So you've created your first real React component, but now it's time to make sure that that component works the way you expect it to. So we're going to add some automated tests to our application. We're going to take a look at how to use enzyme, jest, and see what else we can get into along the way. So the first thing that we're going to do on our testing journey is we're going to run the test that we already have. So if we take a look, we also already have an actual test. So if we look, there's an app.test.js in here. And this is a single React test that doesn't even actually have an assertion. So it's not making sure that something is the way that it thinks it should be. It's just making sure that it doesn't crash, which is fine since app is our top level component. And we call a bunch of other components. If we render this using React DOM, which is the same thing we do for real, and it doesn't crash, then that means we're good to go and we don't have any like obvious glaring errors. So we've never actually run this test, so let's make sure we can do that. And to do that, you're going to use npm test. And so what this is going to do is by default, npm test is a watcher, and it's going to just keep watching. And if you make a change to a file, then it'll run your tests again, or you can push A and it'll go and run your tests. This really isn't the way that I like to run tests. I don't tend to use watchers like this, but they can be handy if you have a split terminal open, but I like to use just one solid terminal for things. So I'm going to show you another way how you can run all of your tests at one time. And our test did pass, which is good. We should have known that since we were able to work with our components in the previous tutorial. So if you hit Q, you can actually quit out of that. And if you want to run all of your tests, you can use an environment variable. So you can say ci true npm test, and this will go and just run it one time and put you back at your prompt. And this is how I'm going to run the tests for the rest of this, just so we can make sure that we're going and I don't have to have a watcher running the entire tutorial. Now that we know that our tests already run, we're going to do a couple things. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go and we're going to grab a package called enzyme. And this is made by Airbnb, and it's a library that's useful for testing the React components. So it has some things to do assertions and to interact with the components when we're in a test environment. So we're going to pull this in and use it for a few tests. And just so you understand what some of the syntax is, that whole it syntax that was taking a block, that comes from Jest, which is another library that is packaged into our application already for testing purposes by Create React App. And this is a test library from Facebook. So this is our actual test runner, and it has some of the assertions that we're going to be working with. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is look at how to install enzyme. So if we take a look at the installation instructions, we're working with the newest React. So we can actually come down here to React 15. This is what we're working with. And we're going to need some extra stuff here. So we're going to need React add-on test utils and enzyme. So let's copy this through the @ sign. It's no longer a release candidate because it's already out. And we'll put that here, and then we'll also make sure we spell this right because my spelling is a little bad. Grab enzyme and put that here. Now, when you go and you run this, you might run into some issues based on your version of NPM, and that's going to be a little bit weird for you to debug potentially, but make sure you go to the newest version of NPM, and then if you do end up running into issues, the things I had to do when I was rehearsing for this to get around those was I had to blow away my NPM cache, and then I removed my node modules from this project, and then I just NPM installed again. So if we take a look at our working tree, we can see that we have two modifications. There's a package.lock file and then the package.json. And with the save dev, that'll add those to our dev dependencies. So let's just take a look at our package.json. And you'll see that there's the enzyme and React add-on test utils right there. Just to make sure we didn't break anything, let's rerun our tests. Speak of the devil. This actually looks shockingly like what I ran into before. So I'm actually going to go through the steps that I just described to you on how to fix a potential issue that you might have with NPM, and then we'll just roll from there. So for this, we're going to do npm cache clean. Apparently it thinks it can fix itself, so let's force this. Now we're going to get rid of our node modules. And we're actually going to get rid of this package.lock.json Whoops. Didn't mean to open it here. And I'm only going this drastic with deleting things because we're really early in the stage of this application, and it's fine to like fix this. There are known bugs with NPM right now, and we're just going to go around and try to get around them. All right, well, things aren't going great, so we're going to try an alternative way around this. And this just comes kind of out of the fact that I hate NPM, but there's Yarn, which is an alternative package manager for JavaScript. And it's not really, I guess it's an alternative client to package management, but we're going to install this. So go to yarnpkg.com and check out their installation instructions for you. Works on every platform. I already have it installed, so I'm going to yarn install. Okay, so it's finished. Now let's try this again. And everything works again. So the moral of the story is don't use NPM, but we're just going to move on from that. So in the same way that our app had an app.test.js, we're going to create a ChordEditor.test.js. And we'll actually do that for right now. We will take our source app.test.js, and we will copy that into source components, ChordEditor.test.js. And that's just so we don't have to recreate all the boilerplate stuff. So open that file up, and then we're going to do some slightly different things in here. So instead of using React DOM, we're going to import shallow from enzyme. And this needs to be a string. And what shallow will allow us to do is similar to how the React DOM is rendering the app here. Shallow is going to allow us to render a component, but it's not going to try to render subcomponents. And so that limits kind of the work that is being done. And then additionally, what it's going to do is it's going to make sure that we're not relying on anything underneath us in order for our tests, like if that makes sense. So we're going to test these things in isolation. So there's no reason for us to test a subcomponent's contents from a parent component because we could do that in a test for the subcomponent anyway. So that's what we're going to do. We'll get rid of this React DOM, and then wherever we say app, we're going to say ChordEditor. Okay, and in addition to just having an it here, we'll use a describe just because I kind of come from Ruby land and I like this as a way of structuring things, but we're going to describe our ChordEditor component, and then we're going to use an anonymous function, and then we'll take this it and drop it inside and indent it a little bit. So the first thing we want to do is we'll say it renders an editor area. And then down here, what we're going to do is we'll say the editor is going to be a shallow render of our ChordEditor component. And then we will expect editor.find text area, because that's really what we want. We want to say that there should be a text area inside of our actual component. And then we will just say that the number that it finds should be equal, so 2 equal 1. And then now I'm going to do something a little fancy in my text editor here, and I'm going to map a command to running the test. So this will run npm test for me from in here. Okay, and if we take a look at what we got here, there are a couple warnings, and these don't have to do with anything we did. This is internal to enzyme, it looks like. So this is an issue that is going to need to be fixed at some point, but it's not something we need to fix right now. And then if we look here, we can see that our tests pass. And if you're familiar with testing, going straight to green is kind of bad a lot of times because you don't know that your test is really any good. So let's change this to be, I don't think we have any inputs, right? So if we do that, we rerun our tests. then it should go off and it fails. Okay, so and it tells you that it expected to have a value of 1, but received 0, and that's because we were using a count. So that makes sense. So we will get rid of that. And then we will do the same sort of test for the output area. And then in here, we will say div dot, and then this actually had a class name. So we'll use chord output. So it renders an output area. We do the same thing. We find our output area and assert that there is exactly one of them. We rerun, that one passes. We're not going to assert that that fails because we already shown that this sort of test works out for us. Those are not super useful tests. Those we're kind of saying that there's a little bit of HTML structure, but it's not really asserting that anything is happening. This is more like testing the view, essentially, which I mean is kind of what React is for, but we have a little bit of functionality in the ChordEditor. So we can write some tests in order to test that. So let's take our general it structure here and our editor. And we actually want to say that it renders out the chord chart output. So it renders chord chart output. And this is a bit of a tricky one for us to write. So what we're going to do is we're going to set another const, and this is going to be our expected output. And this is going to be a little weird because we're actually going to write HTML, but we're going to write it like it's a string. But we'll structure it in such a way that it kind of makes sense to us, I guess. But it's going to be a little bit of a long road here, so bear with me. So it's got a few things going on here, and namely, I guess we'll put these on the same line. We know that it renders out a table whenever we create a chord, right? So we create the string and it goes off and it has to render this table so that it can put the chord text above the exact lyric that it is going off of. So it's going to render by default, since we had that default text, it's going to render something like this. So I think there's type some lyrics here. And then it's going to also put a non-breaking space at the end, which that's something that's kind of annoying, and maybe we'll try to fix that at some point because that's not how I would like it to work. And then it's going to render a closing table tag. All right, and all of those have pluses. So this will combine into one string. So by default, React is going to try to create, it doesn't want to have any extra white space. So we can't write this like we would normally and then check it against a string because there would be extra white space if we wrote it properly indented for us and stuff, which is why we're taking little strings and we're just combining them into a bigger string. It's kind of a bummer, but I'll explain why we have to do this in a second. So the next thing we want to do is we want the real output. And we're going to get this by taking the editor, finding our div.chordOutput, and then getting the HTML from that. And then we will expect the real output index of, because real output's going to be a string because we asked it for the HTML, and this comes from enzyme. We expect the index of our expected output to be greater than -1. So this allows us to, if it is anywhere in the string, then this will return true. So we can just say that this will be true. Now, if we run our tests, it'll render that out and it'll make sure it's there. So now if we make a change anywhere in this string, this will fail. So we can make a really obvious one, right? Like change a TR to a TD, rerun our test, and this will fail. But even if we change something really, minute, so if there's if we went from some lyric, and there you go. So it has to be exact, and that's good for us. That's like an ideal test. This is kind of a bummer that we didn't pass anything into our ChordEditor in order to generate this output. The only reason I just happen to remember that this was the string that we put in there. And this kind of tells me that we went with a slightly wrong design on how we get information into our ChordEditor, but we're going to address that in the next tutorial. But we do have one more test, and that is to kind of test that this stuff actually updates. So if you remember how we did this, when somebody writes in the text area, we render on the fly in real time the changes that are made to the chord chart that they're editing. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take basically this exact same thing, but we're going to modify this to where it looks like a real one. So we're going to say that there's going to be 2 chords in the song, where there's going to be an B and an A minor. I have no idea if these are actually in a real key, but that's going to lead us to having 2 lyrics also. And this will be something like new, and then we'll just have lyric here. So this is our output we're wanting to have. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take our editor and we're going to set the state of it using the setState function. So this is exactly like it was in React land for us. So we know that we have a value, and we're going to set this to a string written in chord pro. So the chord is going to be in square brackets. So this is going to be new, and then we'll have a space, A minor, lyrics, or I guess, well, yeah, let's put an S there. So new lyrics, no non-breaking spaces or anything. And then when we go and we ask the editor to find the chord output HTML, it should, in theory, since we updated the state, it should have re-rendered itself, and it should put it out in the right way. So now we can run this, and hopefully it'll pass. Okay, so we have 5 passing. If we change our chord down here, we'll expect this to fail. So it's now an A instead of an A minor. And it fails, gives us false instead of true. That's kind of a bummer that the assertion couldn't be a little more helpful for us, but this is what we have to deal with right now. So we fixed it again, rerun the test one last time to make sure everything passes, and we're good. So just taking a broad overview of the testing that we covered here, we're using Jest as our test runner, so that provides us with the describe and the expect, and the 2 equal in this case. And then we're using enzyme for the shallow, which is returning this, what's called a shallow wrapper, which gives us some of the methods that we need on that. So we have find, and additionally we had HTML. In our more interesting tests, we kind of ran into this problem where we had to concatenate strings until we could create HTML that was real and compare those. And the reason that we had to do this is because in order for us to set the content of our chord output, we were using dangerously set inner HTML. So if we go back to our chord editor and we come down here and look in our div, we have this dangerously set inner HTML. And what this does is it tells React to not care about what's inside of this div. And that also sort of means that we can't interact with it as if it were a normal part of the component. We can only interact with it as though it's a string. So on other things, I could say find a panel and then find a text area inside of it using enzyme. But in the case of this, I couldn't say find our chord output and then find a table inside and assert that it has some certain elements. So that's just the downside of what we have to do in order to generate and plug in this HTML all the time. And that's kind of a bummer. But our test did show us that our design of our chord editor component is a little bit weird, because we ideally would kind of like this to be almost like a function, right? So you input something and you get something back. And the input happens to be from the outside, right? It's going into a text area and you're changing it, but that could also be coming from inside of our application for the default state. So we could pass something into the chord editor so that it doesn't always just say type some lyrics here at first. And that's something we're going to address in our next tutorial.